Alright guys, so today we're going to talk about the creation of the Constitution. You guys are going to understand why we call the Constitution a bundle of compromises. Have you all ever heard that before? A bundle of compromises? The idea here is when we met at the Constitutional Convention to replace the Articles of Confederation, we actually didn't replace them or revise them, we replaced them completely, right? So large states, small states, all these in between one another are arguing back and forth on what type of government we should have, okay? So as we go through this, you're going to notice you have a chart on that paper. It's got like the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, the Connecticut Compromise, all this stuff. You got to know what those do. And we also got to know who it affected, whether it benefited small states, large states, things of that nature. So hopefully, once we get through all this today, it'll make a lot more sense. So just as normal, or just like normal, I should say, you only have one definition at the bottom of this paper, okay? And it's the word framers. In your notes here, the framers, guys, just simply put down the people who attended the Philadelphia Convention. Now, that's also considered the Constitutional Convention. So you may see it written both ways, Constitutional or Philadelphia Convention. It really doesn't matter. It's referring to the same thing. All right? So beside the framers, those are the people who attended the Philadelphia or the Constitutional Convention. Okay? Everybody with me so far? Makes sense? Yeah. All right. Now, don't worry about any of the rest of that stuff just yet. We're going to talk about it as we go here, okay? So, on your paper, the one that you have, you've got a list of all these plans or compromises, right? Yeah. So, we're going to start with the Virginia plan. Common sense would tell you that the Virginia plan came from which state? Virginia, obviously. So, before we get into all that, though, let's just recap a couple of other things, okay? So the Constitutional Convention, or the Philadelphia Convention, began in May of 1787. You had 55 delegates, okay? If you'll notice on the smart board, you don't have to write any of this down. It's just kind of giving you a brief idea of who all's there. The Constitution makes it sound like common people wrote it. That's actually not true. You got some very intelligent, war-hardened people who have been around politics for the vast majority of their life. The many of them fought in the Revolutionary War. 8 of them signed the Declaration of Independence. 34 of them had attended college. 2 would go on to become president. 1 is vice president. You'd have 19 senators and 13 members of the House of Representatives. So these were distinguished people who wrote our Constitution. Okay? So again, we set out to form a new government. So the framers elected George Washington as the president of the convention, and he set up the procedural rules, meaning he was the guy make sure everybody followed the rules, okay? So, a majority of state delegations would need to be present to conduct business. Each delegation would have 1 vote, and the majority vote would carry a proposal. Very simple terms. You had to have a majority of there from your state, you got 1 vote, and whoever got the most vote won. Simple enough, right? So, let's start talking a little bit about these plans, okay? And again, you already know this part where the articles were replaced, and that's what we're going to talk about. So guys, the very first thing I want you to do, somewhere on that paper, okay, write down that the Constitution is what we call a bundle of compromises, okay? A bundle of compromises. Now, if you remember when we were talking about, I think it was like section 3 of chapter 1, we talked about the 5 basic concepts of democracy, and one of the major concepts of democracy was compromise, right? The ability for people to meet in the middle, so to speak, to find what's best for everybody, all right? So, if we look at this chart and we begin with the Virginia plan, you're going to notice it says plan or compromise, provisions, and then types of states that benefit. Okay? We're going to put a lot of stuff where it says provisions. Okay, because there's a lot of stuff that goes with these plans. And what we're doing, guys, is this is Virginia's idea of the type of government they feel like the national government should be. Okay? Now, at this point in time, is Virginia a small or large state according to population? Is a lot of people live here or not so many people live in Virginia? What do y'all think? It's fairly big. It's one of the biggest states that we have. So what they say is going to have a lot of pull. Okay? So, in your notes it says, the Virginia plan called for a government with a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. We can stop right there. Under the Articles of Confederation, how many branches did we have? One, and it was the legislative. There was no power, there was no court systems, and the executive had no power to enforce laws. You guys see a problem with that? Obviously. That's why we are replacing it. So the first thing that I would write down underneath provisions is 3 separate branches. And again, this is stuff you're going to need to know. But the Virginia plan called for 3 separate branches. The next thing it says Congress would have 2 houses with representation based on state population or the money given to the central government. Now we're going to shorten that. The very first thing is it says how many houses does Congress have? The Virginia plan is calling for 2, meaning it's bicameral. What type of Congress did we have under the Articles of Confederation? It was unicameral, right? You guys need to watch those videos. You know this already. So it was unicameral, okay? So now we're completely changing that. So the second thing I'd put down is a bicameral legislature. So the legislative branch is going to have 2 houses. So far, so simple. Now this next part I'd probably type out in bold because it's very important, okay? It says that representation would be based on what? A state's what? Population. Make sure that that gets put in your notes and it's highlighted, bolded, whatever you need to do. But put down representation is based on population. So what they are saying here is this. The more people that a state has living in it, the more representation they would have in Congress. Now, if they decide to do it this way, which states benefit from it? Larger states. And the smaller states, or the smaller populated states, aren't going to have as much say-so. Okay? And then it goes through and it adds a couple other things. It said Congress would have more power than it had under the Articles. It would be able to force states to obey federal law. Members of Congress would elect the national executive and the judiciary, and these 2 branches would form a council that could veto acts passed by Congress. So what it's essentially saying is it set up some sort of a system of checks and balances. Does that make sense? If it's setting up councils to make sure that each branch is doing what it's supposed to be doing, there's a way to check on it, right? So the last thing I want you to put in number 1 there is a system of checks and balances. All right, so just to recap what we should have beside the Virginia plan. You got 3 separate branches, you have a bicameral legislature, and representation is based on what? Population. Get that in your brain, okay? Now, if we move over to number 2, it says what types of states benefited? Very simply, put down larger, wealthier states. Larger, wealthier states. The ones that were more populated, okay? Larger, wealthier states. Excuse me. Anybody have any questions about that one? The Virginia plan. We good there? All right, let's move on to the next one. You have the New Jersey plan. Now, is New Jersey considered a small or large state at this point in time? Now, a lot of people live there, but at this point in time, not so many, okay? So it would be considered a smaller state, all right? So, what was New Jersey's idea of the type of government that we need to create. First thing I'd put down is they still like the idea of 3 branches. Okay? So put down 3 separate branches. That's one of the few things that the small and large states agreed on, is that the government should have 3 types of branches. All right. The next thing the New Jersey plan did, if you'll notice, it says Congress would have a single house with equal representation from each state. So that little statement there is giving us a lot of information. Okay? So Congress would have a single house. So is it unicameral or bicameral? Unicameral. So jot down unicameral legislature. That is different from the Virginia plan because it called for a bicameral legislature, correct? Yeah. Next part is just as important as the one we put under Virginia plan. Bold or underline, whatever you got to do, this part. It says that this single house would have equal representation for each state. Meaning what? That regardless of the size of your population, regardless of your size of population, you're going to get how many votes under the New Jersey plan? 1. Everybody's equal. So if Virginia's got 20 million people living in it, they get 1 vote. If New Jersey's got 5,000 people in it, they get 1 vote. Okay? So you have a stark contrast in how they think the government should be ran. One is basing things on population. The other one is basing it on equality, meaning that everybody has the same amount. All right? The rest of this is just kind of don't really matter for what we're trying to do. There would be an executive committee, and it would be chosen by Congress. Majority of the states would rule, and Congress could remove members of this committee. The executive committee would appoint a supreme tribunal to be the federal judiciary. That would be the court system. So here's what you should have in number 3 beside a New Jersey plan. 1 is you got 3 separate branches. You have number 2, you got a unicameral legislature. And number 3, everything is based on equality. Everybody has the same amount of votes. Y'all guys with me so far? All right, number 4, the New Jersey plan was going to benefit who? Large states, smaller states, or both? It's going to benefit the smaller states. Because everybody's equal, that takes a lot away from the larger states. Okay? If everybody has the same say-so, it takes away from the more populated areas. All right? So those are our 2 plans of government. Now, if you notice it, they do have some similarities, but for the most part, they are a little different. Okay? So, the next step here is to find a compromise that everybody can agree on. And guess what we call it? The Connecticut Compromise. Before we write anything down with Connecticut Compromise, above the word Connecticut, write down the Great, because you may see this referred to as the Great Compromise as well. Okay? So the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, every which way you want to look at it. Okay? Everybody with me? So, the first thing I would like for you to put down in number 5 is that the Connecticut Compromise is a blending of the Virginia and the Virginia and New Jersey plan. The Connecticut Compromise is a blending of the Virginia and New Jersey plan. So what we're doing is our founding fathers are going to take the parts that they like the most out of each plan, put them together, and hope that this compromise will benefit everyone to the point where they will agree on it. Okay? So, we can kind of look through the notes that we've already jotted down and probably figure out how this is going to go. Did the Virginia and the New Jersey plan both want 3 branches of government? Yes, so that's one thing. Go ahead and put down in number 5, 3 branches of government. So, the 3 branches of government, who's that benefit? Both the large and the small states, right? They both wanted that. The second thing with the Connecticut Compromise, it says that it would also have a bicameral legislature. So put down, bicameral legislature. Who's that benefiting? Small or large? Who wanted that? The Virginia plan, right? They wanted a 2-house Congress, so they got that. But here's the kicker, and here's what you need to put down underneath it. 1 house is going to be based on population. Remember, there's 2 houses of Congress. That's what we've decided on. So 1 house is going to be based on population. That's what the Virginia plan wanted. The second house is going to be based on equality, meaning each state will have the same number of representatives. So again, we're compromising. The larger states got 1 house like they wanted. The smaller states got 1 house like they wanted. Now, if you fast forward to 2020, we still have 2 houses, right? We have a house that is based on population, meaning each state, depending on how many people live in it, that depends on how many representatives you have in the House of Representatives. Just to give you an idea, Virginia has 11 representatives. The state of California has 53 representatives. So if that house is based on population, that would mean that California has 5 times the population that Virginia does, right? Take somewhere like Montana or North Dakota or Alaska, they only have 1 representative. Why? Not very many people live there. You guys get it? So that one is based on population. The Senate, however, is based on equality. Guess how many senators each state has? 2. Virginia has 2. California has 2. Alaska has 2. Everybody has 2. So it's based on equality. Okay? So you have a bicameral Congress, 1 house based on population, while the other one is based on equality. That's what you should have beside a Connecticut Compromise. Is everybody with me? So in number 6, who did that benefit? Everybody. Put down all states. Is this understandable? Is everybody with me here? Makes sense? What about you, Cameron? Yeah. Good. All right. Now, I would like to say that's all the compromising we had to do, and the Constitution was to be put in place, but we obviously know that's not the case. So there's a couple other concepts we need to look at here. If you notice, you've got 2 more compromises on your paper. One of them is called the 3/5 Compromise, and the other one is called the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. So let's talk a little bit about the 3/5 Compromise. You guys know as well as I do, in the 1700s, there were slaves living in the South. There's also slaves living in the North. But the vast majority of them are located where? In the South. You guys with me? Now, if you look at if you look at the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, they are basing representation for each state on a population in one of those houses, right? So all the slave-owning states probably want to count the slaves, right? Well, these other states that don't own slaves, they don't think slaves should be counted because they don't have as many living in their state, meaning they would get outnumbered in the House of Representatives. So they've got to do what? Compromise. They've got to figure out exactly how many slaves they can count in order for it to be fair. So, if you notice, it says the 3/5 Compromise counted each slave as 3/5 of a person when figuring representation in Congress. So just to make this easy, that's 60% of a person that's getting counted. So out of 100 slaves, how many do you think they got to count in the population? 60 of them. Is everybody with me? So beside a 3/5 compromise, just simply put down that slave-owning states got to count 60% of their slaves in the population. That 60% of slaves could be counted in the population. Now, by doing that, who did it benefit, the North or the South, by allowing slaves to be counted in the population? Who benefited from that, guys? Which states?
South.
The South, right? So in number 8, write down southern states for population. They're going to get to count more people, therefore they're probably going to have more representation, okay? But now the North's got to get something as an incentive to let this go. The North isn't just going to say, yeah, count 60% of them. The North says, fine, if you're going to get to count 60% of your slaves, then you should have to pay a tax on it. Does that make sense? So, also in number 7, put down that the states, the northern states, paid taxes on representation just like the South. But who's paying more taxes? If the South's getting to count 60% more of the population, then who's got to pay more taxes, the North or the South?
North.
No,
South.
the South. You guys see what I'm getting at? So even though the South is getting to count more people, they're also having to pay more taxes. So northern states have both taxes and representation was based on population, okay? So the benefit is this. The southern states get to count them in their population. The second part of that, put down northern states get to count it for taxation. They don't have to pay as much taxes. So that benefited the North. So everybody's happy about that. The North pays less taxes. The South gets to count 60% of their enslaved population. Win-win for everybody. It's funny how you can take someone's life and count it at 60% and everybody thinks it's a good idea. Okay? So far, so good. That makes sense? Tell me if it don't. All right. And then the last compromise we have today is called the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. Obviously, the slave trade is booming, right? So the South says, listen, if you're going to make us pay a tax on who we can count in our population, then you shouldn't be allowed to, talking to the national government, then you shouldn't be allowed to tax us when we actually buy slaves at the slave trade. And everybody agreed to that. So what Congress did was, okay, since you're going to pay taxes on the members of the people of the enslaved community that you're going to count towards your representation, then we are not going to make you pay a tax when you buy slaves. Does everybody understand that? So beside of commerce and slave trade, put down that Congress would not tax exports on the slave trade for 20 years. So basically anything that slaves made that was exported out of the states could not be taxed because they were taxing them in their population. So put down Congress could not tax exports of the slave trade for 20 years. Does everybody understand that? And then in number 10, if you can't tax exports on the slave trade, who is that benefiting, the North or the South? It's benefiting the South. That's one less trade. That's one less tax they have to pay. All right. Now, does anybody have any questions about that chart? Does that make sense? Yes, no? We good there? Okay. And then the last thing we need to answer on this paper is number 11. It says, name a group whose interests seem to have been ignored or even harmed by the compromises that created the Constitution. Out of everybody we just talked about, the North, the South, population, equality, all that good stuff, who was not mentioned but had a big part in the shaping of the Constitution? Who y'all think? Did we ask the African Americans if they wanted to be counted 60%? Did we ask them if they wanted to be here? No. So the people that we didn't ignored their thought process is put down enslaved African Americans, slaves. We didn't ask them what they thought. We just kind of done it, which is completely unfair. Does anyone have any questions about those compromises? Do those make sense? All right, so since we're done with that, you will get section 5 through virtual classroom tomorrow. You'll probably end up getting a study guide on Thursday, and we'll probably have a test Friday on chapter 2. Is everybody with me? So does anybody have any questions about those compromises?
How do you say this?
It should automatically save on its own into your drive. All right, if there's no questions.